So good afternoon and welcome to this seminar. So it is the first seminar after summer. As many of you know, before summer, we had a very interesting sequence of seminars. And based on that experience, we made a survey to all attendees, and the response was very good, all unanimous, saying that we should continue with this initiative. So we are now restarting second season, let's say, of seminars of our research center. And today we have as a speaker Professor Raul Rato. He's an invited assistant professor at the Nova School of Science and Technology, and is also a collaborator member of our research center, CTS. So it's a great pleasure to have all of you here. And please remember that after the presentation, we'll have some period for discussion in which you can ask questions. But I would like also to invite you to also offer your comments about the subject, not just asking questions, but you can have maybe different points of view about the topic that will be presented. And this will be also very good to enrich the discussion. So given this, I give the floor to Raul Rato. So please.
Thank you, Professor Camarinha. Distinguished professors, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I am Raul Rato, and I'm going to describe our team research on spike computing for securing the Internet of Things and cyber physical systems. So I'm going to now share the screen with the presentation, and we have this. We have this. Okay, so I think you all are now seeing the first slide on of the presentation. Now, this is an ongoing project that started several years ago in a most innocent way. So we start studying signals, and this is a list of the institutions where we have been working with this project. So we have been doing some work on the Instituto Politécnico de Setúbal, on Uninova. We also had a very fruitful cooperation with the Poznań University of Poland. We also had a contract with the European Space Agency, and more recently we had a contract with a startup, T-Delta, for funding the research. So it all has begun several years ago when we were interested in signals. And we were interested in dealing with the electroencephalogram signals and how they related to the activity of the physical neurons. So we start studying this with a small team here at the faculty, and we developed, just for putting the mind, to clear the mind, a small device that could make some spikes in reaction to light on this light cell. And we started studying how this kind of device worked, and we approached a different way of building electronic neurons with several components and several integrated systems. And the most important thing in this conceptualization that was presented at the Neuroscience Symposium at the Champalimaud Research Center in almost 10 years ago, it was 8 years ago. So we started to make an electronic neuron where the input could modulate the spiking rate. So if the input is low, the spiking rate is low. If the input is higher, the spiking rate is higher. And if the input is changing, suddenly you can see here that there is a change in the spike rate. And if this changes very slowly, we have here some instability, some kind of noisy transition. So here we introduced a different activation function with a catastrophe nonlinearity. And this was very interesting. And at this moment, we started a cooperation with our Polish colleagues who have been studying this kind of device here for several years, and they have a PhD student on the subject. So Simon, as I know, is attending now this presentation, and Damian Judorek, as far as I know, is the PhD student that conduct most of the work on this fundamental science on spiking neurons based on catastrophe theory. So one of the things that we found when we were working with dedicated hardware is that we needed a special kind of activation function here. And so we keep on with the study. Yes? Okay, everything is okay. So we keep on studying, and there were several questions that were raised, namely, what should be the way to encode logical values in the spiking sequences, and what was the best way to put the metric working. So we had to choose between an L1 metric for fuzzy systems, it's an absolute value metric, or Euclidean metric, that it's the standard and usual metric where the Pythagorean theorem is valid. And in the end, we went away from this metric L1 from fuzzy systems, and we went to an Euclidean metric. And the reason to do that is that when we use... Yes, everything okay? Okay. So when we use an L2 metric, we have access, and we can work with linear algebra and complex numbers. So complex numbers are a closed algebraic field, and we all have all the equations in place. If we should stay with an L1 metric, this is an absolute value metric only with real numbers, and our algebraic field would not be closed for all the equations. So in terms of with theoretical considerations on the power of the mathematics involved, we choose the L2 metric. And we proceed, and what we were looking here very carefully was the possible relationship between phase and logic, because most of the literature at the time on coding information on spiking signals were based on rate code, and rate code is a slow code, and we need to change into we need in Internet of Things and to control devices, we need to change and make the device react very quickly to changing conditions. So if we had a slow code, we were by architectural constraints restricted to very slow modes of operation. So we started to look at phase coding of the sorry, of the phase coding of the logic values. And when we were looking at this, we stumbled upon some non-standard logic operations. And that was very interesting for us because we could do all the standard Boolean logic operations, but we could also do non-standard logic, Boolean logic operations. So the question that I may now explain in a tutorial way for everyone is, what is a square root of naught? We all know that we have Boolean values, and the naught value of a Boolean is the other Boolean value. So if I have a true or one Boolean value, the naught, the negation of this value is the false or zero. And this is the way that the traditional Boolean values work. Now, if I represent the Boolean vector, the Boolean vectors, the Boolean values, sorry, the Boolean vector values by a vector, so I am saying the Boolean value 0 or false is this vector. The Boolean vector, the Boolean value 1 or true is this other vector. So I have two vectors, and I say this vector stands for the logical 0, and this vector stands for the logical 1. And as I am in a linear algebra realm, I'm saying that these vectors are base vectors with unit energy. So this one is a base vector, this one is a base vector. They have unit energy, unit modulus, if you want to, and they are orthonormal to each other. So I can write a mixed logical value like this. I have here a value that multiplies this vector, and I have here another value that multiplies this vector. So I have this vector of values, and this encodes the logical value, and this logical value is encoded with a L2 metric. It's not a fuzzy logic, it's a logic based on a L2 metric. And so we discovered that we were dealing with quantum logic. And when we started doing this, we realized that gates are metrics. In this linear algebra, a gate is a matrix that changes this vector of Boolean values to another vector of Boolean values. And so the identity gate is the identity matrix. And what is a square root of naught? A square root of naught is this matrix that it's here, I'm going down and I want to go up. Oh dear, how could I move the slides back? Okay, this one is good. So we went to this matrix that is the square root of naught. Okay, and if I multiply this matrix with itself, if I square this matrix with itself, I would get this matrix that it's the naught. If I multiply this matrix with itself, it will give me the identity matrix. So this matrix that is here is called a square root of naught because when applied twice gives me a naught. And this cannot be done with classic Boolean logic. Okay, this is a new kind of logic, and it's well known in quantum computing logic. So this is not possible to be done using Boolean logic, classical Boolean logic. And so we went on, and let me explain now what is the effect, what is the difference between classic probabilities and quantum probabilities. If I have classic probabilities, I could have here a mixing device. And this mixing device, if I put this bit on the input, will produce this output with this probability, and will produce this output with this transition probability here. And the same goes here. So the probability of seeing this here, this output, depends on the probability of this path and the probability of the direct path. And so I can do some calculations and say the probability of 0 is this and that, and the probability of 1 is that one and this one. Now, I can have one of these devices and then after, again, a copy of the same device, okay? And I assume mathematically and in physical that the two events, the two tossings are independent. So we have this law for the transformation of probabilities. And if I put here half, 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 I will have a mixing device, and the probabilities here will be always mixed and will be independent of the original probabilities here. So what happens? If I mixed with a standard device with half, 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 here I will have mixed probabilities. And here again, I will have mixed probabilities again. So if I put all the transitions probabilities equal, I will get a mixed result here. And once mixed is always mixed. I cannot go back and recover the original values. So this is classic probability. Now, we are going to use not classic probability, but probability amplitudes, where these numbers here are complex numbers. And the classical probability is the modulus square of this number, okay? And so goes the story and the calculations. And if I put one of these devices with this probability amplitudes, what I look here, I see completely random occurrences here. But if I put here again, I have this kind of difficulty going back one slide. I cannot, okay, I figured it out. Okay, so I was here, slide 14. So this here is completely random, and I have no information on what was the starting point here. But if I put again the same gate, exactly with the same coefficients, then I will have here this. This will be 1, this will be 1, this will be 0, and this will be 0. So the probability of transition here is 1, the probability of transition here is 1, and this will be 0, and this result is utterly deterministic. Okay, so I have here a probabilistic square root of identity gate, and this is called H1 Hadamard gate. It's a well-known gate. Now, if I put these complex values here, I will have a square root of naught probability amplitude gate. And if I put it here, I put them in tandem, and I change the 0 to 1 and the 1 to 0 in a most deterministic way. And if someone snoops here, sees random numbers. Here it's deterministic numbers. They are all connected here, but here they are random. So what we have looked was that we can build, the most interesting result was that we can build non-standard Boolean gates. There is some theory that tell us that there are out there waiting to be built some non-standard Boolean gates. This is a mathematical result. This is not yet an engineering result, but we know that mathematically it was possible. So if we could build a computing device that could do that, that would be possible. And we could do that with bits. But we don't want to do that with bits. We want to do that with physical signals, with spikes. How can we build a device that does the computing with spikes, with physical thing, not with bits programmed in a digital way, but in a physical device that works with spikes? And so we were looking on ways of doing the square root of naught and to make the square of the square root of naught or any other power here. And what have we found? We have found this, that accordingly to classic communications theory, if I have the probability here equal to this probability, so if 0 transmutes itself into 0 or into 1 with equal probability, and if 1 changes and transitions to 0 and to 1 with equal probability, the capacity of the binary channel in the classic sense is closed, is 0. Here the communication channel is closed. So this result was very strange for us because we were able to transmit information from one point to the other, but in the middle, the classic channel was closed. So this is the most interesting device. Other functions can be tailor-made. I can do other functions, not only the square, but mathematically I can produce other functions and other working points. Hello, is there any doubt, any question? Okay, so I'm going to continue, and please put all your questions and comments at the end. So we were working with this, and we found that we could put not the square root, but with a fractional exponent here or here or here or other position. But the question is, we need a square root here, the full square root, to be with the channel closed, to get 0 communication at the classic level. And so a question was raised that how can we manufacture a square root of naught to secure a classic channel. And this will not work at the data layer. We are not changing bits. We are changing the waves. We are changing the physicals that embody the bits. So we are not working with a cipher security. We are working with physical layer security. And we started looking not on ways to do this at the data layer, because we are not working with bits, but we were working with the physical representation of the bit. So we were working not with a discrete logic, but with a continuous distance in a algebra linear, in a vectorial space, and with signals in a physical layer. And so it's now time to do a little tutorial on the differences between the data layer and the physical layer in a communication system. The data layer is where the bits and the words stand. What is the physical layer? For print is the ink and the paper, is not the letters. The letters on the paper are the data layer. The ink and the paper is the physical embodiment where the letters are written. So this is the physical layer. For voice, the physical layer is the sound in itself, is the movement of the molecules in the air. That is the physical layer where the sound exists. And so if I am working with digital communications, and when I am working with Internet of Things or cyber physical systems, we need to work with data link. We need to work with communications, and we need to secure those communications, namely for securing the critical infrastructures. So we were not approaching security by making good encryption of the data link layer of the bits, but we were approaching security by securing the transmission through the medium, through the channel, from one system to the other. And so we put here some kind of wave that it's very difficult to understand or even to detect. So one of the things that sprout from here is that we can reach a point where the only people that listen to our communications are the people we intend to. So if we want someone not to be able to listen, we can make a signal that it's the same as the background noise, and someone that is listening to the communication doesn't know if we are silent or if we are communicating. So this is another advantage of this approach. And here, if we put the system with a physical layer security device here, the wavelength here is changed to something, and this something is only understood by this and retrieve the physical wavelength that incorporates the bit stream, and this is demodulated and transformed into the normal bit stream. And so I can now use encryption software or decryption software, encryption software here, decryption software here. But here the transmission medium is very, very strange and different from the usual. And so what is the model that we are talking about? We are talking about this, the physical link between two systems. I have here one Internet of Things system. I have here another Internet of Things systems. This one is the source of information, and this one is the receiver of the information. And what goes through the channel, the physical link between these two systems, is the signal. The signal can be a sound, a radio wave, an electric current, a photon. But the physical layer is the channel, noise, signal mix. It's all this mix that is the physical layer. And so, what stands for us? The channel is as it is. We have a connection from here to there, and that's the connection that it's available. The noise, the natural noise, is as it is. We have no major control, if any at all, on the natural noise. So what can we, from an engineering point of view, manipulate? What we can manipulate is the signal. So from the engineering point of view, this is a design problem of a source receiver. This is a source receiver design problem. How can I design a device that communicates in a noise-like way, in a very subtle wavelength? I would say it's wavelengths. We do wavelengths. So why is it important to secure the physical layer? Because the attacks today are on the data layer. So we have some password crackers, some software available on the internet. We have all those stories of people cracking codes. Okay, we are not making a code. We are changing the rules of the physical representation of information. And so how can this be used? Okay, this is used for Internet of Things. This can be used for cyber physical systems, but as a matter of fact, this can be used for all kinds of computations and communications. And so back to the basics. Where were we? We were here saying that we need to close the channel in a classic way, but keep it open in a quantum way. So the question was, the research problem was how to design and manufacture a square root of naught to secure a classic channel. Okay, this was the research problem. And we had some insights on this. So this is a small robot that was made with spike control. Okay, this was a work on Setúbal from these two students, and they were trying to compute and control with spikes. And then after that, we went to the European Space Agency. They have an Internet of Things problem with all those satellites and interaction between systems. And we approach them and say, we want to research how can we compute and control with spiking neurons in space. So they funded our research, and this is a small spike controlled car. All these things here are spiking neurons that are attached here to the motors. And this has here a sensor that reads this maze. And the first time, the robot doesn't know the way and is exploring all the ways until the target. And the second time we started from the same position, he has learned the path. The neurons have changed the internal status, and it will go straight forward to the target. Okay, this is a very slow device because we were interested in understanding how the signals, how the phase interact. We didn't want to make it fast. We want to make it easy to analyze and to register all the signals and to study all the interactions that were taking place. So this video, I could send for the interested parties the video. It's about 20 minutes. The first time he tries several ways to reach the end. In the last one, he goes directly because the neurons have learned how to solve the problem. And so this was our project for the European Space Agency. And mind that this project is not quantum. This project is 100% classic. We want to solve classically solve problems in the Internet of Things and in cyber physical systems. And we are working to solve those problems with spiking neurons. But we had to present also a theoretical framework for doing this. And in the final report to the European Space Agency, this is the final poster for the European Space Agency, but there was a breakthrough in this research. And the breakthrough was this. A spike is very useful because it uses all the available bandwidth in a communication channel. And so the spike uses all. This is the formula, the well-known formula for a communication channel capacity. And this is in bits per second. This is the bandwidth of the channel in hertz. And this is the power of the signal and the noise in watts. And so this formula is the way, it's the theoretical way to understand how some device can be better suited or not to use a capacity of the channel. If my device doesn't use all the bandwidth, I am putting restrictions at the architectural level. So if I use a spike, I'm using all the available bandwidth to do my engineering job. But a spike is very difficult to process in time because a spike here has a very strong voltage and then it rests during the rest of the time. And so from the electronic point of view, this is a very aggressive way of working. And it was indeed so because we had several problems here with this kind of spikes, namely on the depletion of the batteries and to running the motors. That was not a good signal. It was a very aggressive signal. And so we were tackling here how we could produce a spike that uses all the available bandwidth, but in time it has a more convenient way of behavior, as a more convenient behavior. And so we introduced a delayed spike by a fractional unit. Okay, and so we went to these colleagues of ours that had produced an idea, was that we can have fractional spikes. And if we delay a spike not by 1 unit of time or 2 units of time or 3 units of time, this is in a discrete time environment. if I delay the spike by a fractional unit of time, and mind that we are working in a discrete time system, and we are going to delay the spike a fractional unit of time. And so what we do observe is this kind of behavior of the system, and this is the time domain. But if I'm going to look at the signature of the spike on the frequency domain, it's exactly the same. So by using fractional spikes, I can solve the engineering problem of using spikes in a practical way in an electronic device. And the conclusions of the work with the European Space Agency were the advantage of spikes. To use spikes in a practical way, they must be fractional in the time domain. And the question that we were facing at that time was how to work with fractional spikes, how to design logical gates for fractional spike processing. Okay, now we have this solved, and I'm going to tell you how we have solved this problem. So, mind the following: while the classic work on the ESA robot was working, we continued the efforts to build a square root of knot with non-fractional spikes. Okay, these are classic spikes, and we were at this time, we have not finished the ESA project. We didn't have that breakthrough, and we were working with integer time spikes. And we build, we call this coherent because we are very keen of the phase effects, and this must all be coherent, and all the phases must be in place in order for the events to happen the way they should happen, and all the phenomena involved to be, from an engineering point of view, correct. And so we build a first successful design with many voltage. We build a second successful prototype only with a dual voltage, and then because we were aiming at space components, we want only a single voltage design for this device. And so we reach a point where we have this situation. We can build square root of knot devices using classic non-fractional spikes. But we know that using fractional spikes is the best way to do electronics. So we must put together these two things. And what have we done? We have made another contract for financing. This time the ESA contract was over, the time was over, and we have an entrepreneur that made a startup specifically for this project and give us the financing with the service provision agreement with Uninova. And we started to do spikes, fractional and convenient, as for digital signal processing. And we figured a way for each to change and to translate each complex valued qubit into a real signal. And for instance, as the qubits are complex signals, are complex valued, let me explain this better. If I go back here, I can go here and say that a qubit, it's here, a qubit, it's a two position vector with complex values. So I have here one, I have here the other component, one component, the other component. These are complex valued components on a base that it's here. This is my vector base for the 0. This is my vector base for the 1. Now, we have figured out a way to produce real signals, because all the signals we have in electronics are real, and so we produce these wavelets. These are real valued wavelets suitable to be built on analog device from these coefficients, and I can put these two wavelets to represent the first complex value of the qubit, and I can put this complex value, these two wavelets, to represent the second complex value of the qubit. And the most interesting is this one as unit energy, this one as unit energy, this and this are orthogonal, this one as unit energy, this one as unit energy, this and this are orthogonal, but they are also orthogonal, this with that, this with that, that with that, that. Okay, they are all orthogonal. So these, in fact, are an orthonormal base for a four-dimensional vectorial space. And this is not, okay, the trick, the base trick here is this is not a four-dimensional vectorial space. We built an electronic device, then produce 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we have 6 numbers, and we are dealing in a 6-dimensional vectorial space to represent a 4-dimensional vectorial space that stands for a 2-dimensional vectorial space, complex vectorial space. Oof, that's hard. Okay, I'm going to state that again. We have figured out a solution that uses real signals, standard real signals. These real signals they live in a 6-dimensional real vectorial signal. In this 6-dimensional real vectorial system, we define it a subspace of 4 dimensions that it's by these 4 vectors, this one, this one, this one, and that one. And these 4 vectors can represent the qubit, the 2-dimensional complex vectorial system of the qubit. Okay, we need to do that because we had to put some restrictions. This being a discrete time system, we need to take care of the DC component and the Nyquist component, and so we were forced to increase the dimensional of the embodiment, the physical embodiment, to 6 dimensions in order to have precision, analog precision, to build a 4-dimensional set of real signals that embodied the 2-dimensional complex vector space that is the home of the qubit logical value. Okay, please, if you have questions here, take note and ask me in a few minutes, because I'm about to finish my presentation on this. But okay, now at this point we have the signals, and the other breakthrough that we were working with T-delta came on this matrix. Okay, so we have this matrix, and if I'm going to use digital signal processing only with reals, I have to change the complex valued matrix, this matrix. Okay, let me go back and mind you that the square root of naught matrix is a 2 by 2 matrix with complex values. These are the standard and classic well-known values for the square root of naught. And this are the values that we were able to compute for the square root of naught using this kind of vectors as base vectors to represent the qubits. So if we represent the qubits by not in a complex two-dimensional vectorial space, but if I put the qubits in a 6-dimensional real space, then I have to change the gate matrix. I have to accordingly change the gate matrix, and this is what is made here. So this is the matrix for doing the square root of naught. And if you think that this enables us to do not only the square root of naught, but other quantum gates like the Hadamard and others, then what you see is that we, working with fractional spikes, we have a way to make quantum computations using real signals. Okay, and this is very important because if I have this kind, okay, this is a summary. Here are the coding of the vectors, and if I multiply this by the gate, I will get this. And if I multiply this again by the gate, I will get this. This is the negation of this one. I go from this, multiply by the matrix, get there, multiply again by the matrix, reach here. So I can use wavelets to do quantum digital signal processing. And suddenly we were in the qubit race, and we believe that the use of fractional spikes and digital signal processing is the solution, and it enables us to get physical layer security in Internet of Things, cyber physical systems and beyond. And also we are dealing with signals. So if I look at the signals from a historical perspective, there is a difference between the signal as an abstract entity and the technology to deal with the signal. And so if I'm speaking on the phone, I always have the voice as my signal, but the technology changes a lot. If I'm working at the data layer and I want to store bits, I have lots of technology to store files and to store pictures and to store sounds. But technologies are always evolving, but the bits, the signals are the same. And if I am in the quantum race for qubits, I have lots of technologies to do quantum computing, but the signals are the same. And so we think that we may have a way of doing this kind of computing without being arrested or stranded in a particular technology or in a particular way of doing that thing. So we have a device independent technology for doing this kind of computation and for securing the physical layer. And so the main conclusion is the use of fractional spikes in digital signal processing allows us to have non-classical computing in a very controlled and replicable way. And this is ready for immediate application. Now is the time for questions. The big question for me after all this is if the brain, is it a quantum computer? Well, I don't know. But from the engineering point of view, this allows non-classical computing and is ready for immediate application. Thank you very much, and I would be I'm ready to answer all your questions and listen to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Raul. So right now we have some time. It would be good to have questions from the attendants. And I would also suggest that you could turn your cameras on while you can then ask questions or make comments about the presentation. So we have one hand raised by João Góes.
Hi, Raul.
Hi.
Just one brief question. How do you think that quantum computing can let's say, shred the existing cryptographic systems? Do you think it will be a problem in the near future? Can quantum computing break the existing systems?
Well, that's a very welcome question. Most of the time we listen to quantum computing as the solve-all technology for all computing problems. And we have faced here some so-called exponential problem computing, and we have faced that and we have seen that. Now, I must call that there is a major difference between working with bits at the data layer and working with information at the physical layer. So if I am doing crypto and I'm using a hash function, I am working with algorithms at the data layer. If I want to secure the transmission of the hash function from one device to the other, then I need to secure not only the cryptographic transit, but also the physical transit. And this is where we are. We have some tantalizing results that classical exponential grade problems could be solved using this kind of non-standard Boolean logic in linear time. We have several examples of that. I didn't refer in this presentation, but we have found that. But there is no general rule for doing that. Let me explain this in another way. One of the main reasons for main trusts, main motivations for our research was to find a way to build any kind of gate. And using this kind of real base, and then if the gate is defined this way, then I have to do this matrix, real matrix. If the gate is made this way, then I have to do that matrix. Okay, how to translate complex gates to 6-dimensional gates, for instance. Okay, and that was one of the main trusts in our research. And we don't have the same for all exponential problems. For some exponential problems, we have a solution. For real life exponential problems, we don't have a solution. I would like to say we don't have yet a solution, but from a theoretical point of view, I'm not sure if the yet can be put in this, if there is not a kind of toy problems that look exponential, but in kind of this trans-Boolean logic, they are not exponential, but real life problems have a kind of complexity that even with trans-Boolean logic, this kind of logic, they still remain forever exponential. So this is a real good question, and it's an open research question. Thank you very much, João.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's another question from Vitor Vaz da Silva.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Raul, for your presentation. It was very clear, and I understood everything, and it gave me an insight of lots of things that I didn't know about this kind of communication and computation. I'm referring to your slide number 16. I don't know if it's possible.
I'm going to share the screen.
Okay. You can easily go to there. You just press 16 and enter, and then you will go to the slide when you present it.
Okay, I'm sorry, Trek.
Okay.
Okay, this is.
Okay, that's the slide. No, sorry. That's the slide. So I have two questions here. One is where you say the information is random on that point. Does it mean that if I put something random there, is it the same as putting the deterministic input? What I'm trying to say is, for example, if it's random, then I understand how you extract this, because it's based on those probabilities that you put in there. But,
hello, Vitor. May I help you with your question?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to say several concepts, and then you say that is the concept I'm trying to ask. Okay? Okay. So, first thing, we are not presenting here a random string of bits. We are just presenting one bit here. And that bit can be 0 or 1. It's fixed. Okay? I put here a 0. And if I look here with a detector, the detector will randomly detect 1 or detect 0. And then if I put the same detector here, it will always detect. This is the square root of naught. So this will detect here, always will detect. If I put 0, will detect 1. If I put 1, it will detect 0. So I can repeat the random experience several times. In one time, I put here a 0, put the detector here, and I will have a random result. And put the detector here, and I will have 1. Then I can start the system again and put a 0 here. And if I put the detector here, I will have a random result. And here I will have a deterministic result. But each time I do a random experience anew. Okay, so is this the kind of behavior that you were talking about, or was with a random string here?
No, I understand that what you put over there actually is that vector that is going to be the result of the two vectors on that orthogonal space, correct? That's the input eventually.
Yes, I put here a vector.
Yes.
This is a vectorial input. I put here the result of the detection.
Exactly.
Mind the following. The detector doesn't detect the probability. It always gives me 0 or 1 as answer.
Yes.
Okay?
So following this, what I mean is, if I put two deterministic detectors in parallel, will they have the same result? I think the answer is yes.
Okay. Now, in this device, we have this device. Sorry. This. In this prototype, they will give you always the same detection result. Okay? It's not, okay. The answer is yes and no. Because I cannot build two exactly equal detectors. There is always some difference in the manufacturing of the detectors. So sometimes I do the experience with the same detector in the middle and then the detector in the end. Other times I use one detector here and one detector down there. And the other times I use two detectors in parallel in the same place. If I have two detectors in parallel in the same place, the output is highly correlated in this design. And we changed, because of that, we changed the way we build detectors. And now we have, let me go here. Here, okay. We have looked how these guys of the University of Texas do the detectors, and they built a random source of entropy. They built the detector with a random source of entropy inside. And so, even two detectors built to the same specifications and as equal as the technology can grant us, they will have different output probabilities and will be uncorrelated. And using this kind of insight for this circuit here, we have changed the detector and have built a new detector. At least we have built 5 new detectors, all equal, but all of them are statistically independent in the output, because they have an internal entropy source. The interesting thing is that in the deterministic way, they still are deterministic. So the way the thing works is when there is uncertainty, the entropy source, that's not because uncertainty, okay, this goes like that. The detectors have an operation, internal operation, that is by a matched filter. That's the way detectors are made in a linear algebra sense, is by a matched filter, or if you want, by a projection operator. If you are working in telecommunications, you call matched filter. If you are working in physics and quantum, you call it a projection operator. And as a result of that projection, we have in this kind physically an electric tension, and this tension feeds a comparator, and the output of the comparator is the output of the detector. So the detector always output a 0 or a 1, but the way the things go to the comparator can and is subject to a lot of research.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Another point by Simon.
Hello.
Yes. Hello. Thank you, Raul, for your presentation. As always, very interesting and very inspiring. I've got one comment and one question. Can you come back to slide? It was probably number 33.
This one?
Yes. Thank you a lot for this explanation, because I always ask myself how to use spikes to control something. It's a very difficult task for me. Using spikes for computing seems to be quite easy, not very easy, but quite easy to processing something, but how to control movements using spikes. So thank you for this explanation. And the question is about slide number 30, about a robot for European Space Agency.
This one?
No, 30.
Ah. Okay.
Okay. The question is, did I understand it correctly that it is a self-learning system?
Yes.
And what's the architecture of the network? I mean, how many layers, how many neurons, and what kind of learning algorithm do you use? If you can answer for this, of course.
Thank you very much for the question. And that was a very tricky question to answer in the hot of those days, because we started to do things very by the book, and we, in the end, we have a mess. Okay, we just wanted to put the damn thing working. And in the end, it was a mess. And I'm going to explain. Because motors have a specific driver circuit. You must feed the circuit from the batteries, and they have an electronic device for feeding the motor. And we have to control that electronic device with the spikes. And the spikes were always going on and going off, going on and going off. And so that kind of device was all confused. So we had to, in a way, to try to slow down the changing of the spikes. And we used capacitors to do that near the power end of the agora não, por favor. Near the power end of the motors. Then we have the batteries that didn't like to be to work on a spike drain. Okay, the batteries like to have a very nice drain of electricity. They don't like to have spikes. So we also had to look for a couple of batteries technologies to do that. And in the end, what we have is we have specific neuron spikes uncoupled, memory neurons. We have specific neurons for memory uncoupled from the batteries and from the motors. In the middle, there were specific neurons for memory. And when there were some spikes, some neurons that when that reached a dead end and had to come back, they would change the state of one of those neuron spikes. And in the end, the neuron spikes only, the memory neuron spikes only control that when the robot faces, look now, the robot is facing a bifurcation, and he has to decide if he goes left or if he goes right. Okay, so we had a startup initial conditions for the neuron memories. And with that initial startup, he always do the same thing ever and ever. But when he finds that he was wrong, he backtraces and changes that the state of that memory neuron. So the next time he repeats the way, he's not going to turn right, he's going to turn left. Okay, memory neurons only control the behavior at the when the path divides in two. Am I being specific enough, or do you still have a question?
I'm not sure how you choose the weight of connections. I mean, is there something like plasticity mechanism in synapses, or is it something very different from this?
It was a rate code. So the neurons had a comparator that produced a rate code, and we put a signal that when changed, the rate code will always change. And so we put we use the catastrophe, the hysteresis in the cusp catastrophe, to guarantee that it would change from one position to the other, and it would not be easy to change back. So that was it.
Okay.
Okay. Now, for further details, I think I have here a colleague of mine. It's a young researcher. Please, João Pires, estás aí?
Yes, I am. Are you?
Yes. Okay, João. Okay, João was the magician behind the fine-tuning of the neurons for solving the maze. I don't know if João is capable of giving you additional details.
Because as you said, Professor, the process is pretty simple. We have, in this case, as you called it, the spike car has 5 neurons. Each neuron gives an ability to the car. And each neuron has 2 states depending on the frequency of the spikes. Depending on the output frequency of the spikes that is decided by the inputs of the neuron. So we have 3 neurons that are responsible for the motor functions, for moving a wheel backwards or forward, and we have 2 neurons that's the 2 memory neurons, since we have 2 bifurcations. After he processed the first try to solve the maze, he understands when he was wrong. So he changed the states of the neurons automatically, because he detects that it was a wrong decision. And on the second time, he checks the neuron states at the bifurcations to choose where it goes. But the states of the neurons are defined by the output frequency of them, that may change accordingly to the inputs of the neuron. But the thing is that they are a bit different. The memory neurons are a bit different from the motor neurons. For the motors, as the professor said, you use the motor drive that receives the signals from the neurons and drives the signals to the motors so they can go forward or backward. I don't know if I answered the question.
Okay, thank you, João. I think it was overkill now. It's much details.
Thank you a lot.
Are you okay, Zaman?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay, but then you can send me a mail and ask all your questions, okay, in due time.
Of course, I will send.
Okay, see you. See you.
Any other question or comment? So we are reaching the end of the time. So let me thank all of you for attending this seminar and for the ones, especially the ones that put questions and comments. And finally, and above all, thank Raul for his presentation. So it was very interesting to have a different subject in the list of seminars, so great. And now I would just like to invite you to continue coming or joining us for the future seminars. In principle, we will keep the same frequency as in the past, about every 2 weeks. So the next seminar will tentatively be on 10 of November. I will confirm it later. So not necessarily all seminars will be on Wednesdays, but we'll try to keep more or less one every 2 weeks. So all of you are welcome. And now have a nice evening.
Okay, see ya.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.